3 years ago, around late November, my partner and I experienced something unsettling that still gives me chills. At that time, we were living in Portland and often spent weekends surfing. Our favorite spots included Cannon Beach and Long Beach, which required long drives but offered excellent waves. That weekend, however, the surfing conditions were poor. The forecast warned of rough seas and stormy weather along the coast. Disappointed, we began searching for safer alternatives and decided to explore some locations along the Columbia River instead. The area is beautiful but quite isolated. To get there, we had to drive along Highway 101, which stretches through sparsely populated regions. The highway has very little cell service, and the towns along it are tiny and far apart. We settled on a spot called Riverbend, a place we had visited a few times before and felt familiar with. According to the forecast, the best surf would be early in the morning, so we decided to drive there the night before and sleep in our car to catch the waves at dawn. Since it was late November, the weather was cold, and we didn't want to spend extra money on a motel or campsite. Parking by the river seemed like a practical and peaceful option. We assumed the area would be deserted, and we were mostly right. We arrived around 3 p.m., and the only other vehicle nearby was an old RV with a young couple inside. Everything felt normal until around 7 p.m. We parked, made dinner, and I took a short walk by the river. Just before sunset, we heard a strange whistling sound and noticed a man walking down the dirt road toward the riverbank. He had come from the highway, which was strange since there's almost nothing nearby. The highway isn't a place where people usually walk, given how desolate it is. My partner and I found it odd and a bit unnerving. The man greeted the young couple, and they invited him to join their campfire. That was the last we saw of them that evening because we decided to go to sleep around 8 p.m. An hour later, I woke up and cracked open the car door to get some fresh air. I noticed that the RV was gone, and for some reason, it unsettled me. It was odd since we had seen the couple earlier, sitting by their fire. I couldn't explain why I felt uneasy, so I dismissed it as exhaustion and tried to sleep. I woke up again around 10:30 p.m., this time sitting up abruptly and startling my partner. He asked what was wrong, but I told him I wasn't sure. He seemed calm and went back to sleep, but I stayed awake, listening for any sounds outside. After 15 minutes of silence, I lay back down, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Another 20 minutes passed, and I woke up yet again. This time, my partner was already awake, sitting still and listening intently. His expression made me uneasy. When I turned on the car's interior light and asked what was happening, he whispered that someone had been tapping on the car windows. My heart sank. We sat frozen for a moment, and then I grabbed a flashlight and pepper spray while my partner stepped out to check. Everything outside was eerily quiet and pitch dark. He walked toward the trees behind the car while I stayed near the vehicle, scanning the riverbank with my flashlight. Seeing nothing, I sat on the back bumper, feeling the tension growing. After a couple of minutes, my partner returned quickly. "We need to leave," he said. "There's a car parked by the exit road with its engine running and lights off." My stomach dropped. We scrambled to throw our belongings into the back of the car, started the engine, and headed toward the road as fast as we could. In our rush, we made a wrong turn, heading further away from the main highway. To our horror, we saw the car from earlier again, this time with its headlights on, speeding up behind us. The narrow road was flanked by dense forest on one side and the river on the other, leaving us with no room to escape. We spotted a small side road ahead and swerved sharply onto it. The car following us kept going straight, speeding down the main road. We didn't stop until we were back on Highway 101, driving as fast as we could toward the nearest town. Though we weren't followed the rest of the way, the experience left us shaken. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, and I can't stop wondering what the person, or people, in that car intended. My brother, 2 years older than me, has always been my go-to partner for camping trips. We've spent endless hours in the wilderness together, doing everything from building forts and creating BMX trails to hunting and exploring. Since 2015, we've traveled across the country, venturing into deep caves, hiking rugged canyons, and scaling cliffs whenever we could carve out time from our schedules. I need to stress this because there's nothing I wouldn't do or face when he's by my side. But this trip was different, and we both felt it. We've had our share of wild experiences, but this one lingers in my mind like a shadow I can't shake. At the time, we were both in our mid-20s, and it happened in 2019. This was probably my 5th time hunting in that area, but it was the first time I brought my brother along. The forest is vast, with only a few rough back roads, most of them narrow 2-tracks stretching for miles. We packed my truck with all the essentials, including 3 tents, one for each of us to sleep in and a third as a space to store our gear and change clothes. The drive into the forest was long, with dense trees and thick underbrush lining the rough, winding paths. We were deep in the wilderness, at least 9 or 10 miles from the nearest paved road. We arrived late at night, set up camp, and quickly fell asleep after the tiring drive. The following day, we spent hours scouting the area and tracking, then returned to camp for the night. After cooking dinner and sharing a few drinks, we chatted for a while. Though it was still relatively early, we were worn out from the day and decided to turn in for the night. Up to that point, everything felt normal. But in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by something hitting my tent, followed by my brother urgently calling my name. I could immediately tell something wasn't right. I called back to him, and within moments, he unzipped my tent and stepped inside. He looked shaken, his face pale. When I asked what was going on, he grabbed my arm and whispered, "Quiet, the sun wasn't up yet." So I guessed it was around 4:30 or 5 a.m. We sat in silence, trying to make sense of the situation. Then we both heard it, a sound I still can't fully comprehend. The closest description I can give is a woman's laughter, echoing through the trees in varying tones, almost as if it was coming from far away. The laughter would pause briefly, only to return with eerie consistency. Then it changed, morphing from high-pitched giggles to deep, guttural noises that seemed to reverberate through the ground. Looking back, I wish I had grabbed my phone to record it, but in the moment it didn't feel real. I was too stunned to think clearly. The unsettling sounds continued until the first hints of daylight appeared. I think it lasted for about an hour, though I can't say for sure. We didn't speak a word during the entire ordeal. It felt as though the air around us was charged with electricity, like static clinging to my skin. Just as the noise stopped, rain began to fall, and soon we were caught in one of the most intense thunderstorms I've ever experienced while camping. The weather forecast had shown clear skies for our entire trip, so the sudden storm caught us off guard. The wind was so strong that it ripped out the stakes anchoring our tents and gear. These were stakes we had driven deep into the ground with an axe. It would have taken considerable force to pull them out. My brother doesn't like to talk about that night. He insists it was just the sound of machinery being dragged somewhere in the distance. But at the time, we both felt uneasy and deeply unsettled. It was strange to hear such noises in the dead of night, especially so far from any town or industrial site. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal, but I have no explanation for what we experienced that night. It's a memory that still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to go camping alone for the first time. It wasn't my first camping trip, but it was the first time without friends or family. I wanted the solitude, the break from work and people. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any trails. It was early October, the days cool, the nights cold, and the forest full of falling leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the reserve and hiked in about 5 miles. The trail faded after 2, leaving me to navigate with a map and compass. The walk was quiet except for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a bird. It felt peaceful at first, just the kind of escape I wanted. By late afternoon, I found a clearing and set up camp. The space was small, surrounded by tall, bare trees. A stream ran nearby, its sound soothing. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. I made a simple dinner, boiled some water for tea, and sat by the fire as the sun disappeared. The forest changed as darkness fell. What had felt peaceful during the day now seemed vast and unfamiliar. The trees cast long shadows in the firelight, and the sounds of the forest grew louder. I told myself it was just animals moving in the underbrush, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Around 10 p.m., I decided to sleep. I doused the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it tight. The air was cold, but my sleeping bag was warm. I lay there listening to the forest, trying to let the sounds soothe me, but my mind kept drifting. What if something came into the camp? What if I got lost on the way back tomorrow? At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke to the sound of leaves crunching. It wasn't constant, just a few steps, then silence. My first thought was a deer, maybe sniffing around for food. I stayed still, listening, trying to calm my breathing. Then the steps started again, slow and deliberate, moving closer to my tent. They were too heavy for a raccoon and too slow for a deer. My heart raced as I lay there frozen, unsure of what to do. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. Then, to my horror, the fabric of the tent moved slightly, like something or someone had brushed against it. I felt a surge of panic but forced myself to stay quiet. I reached for the small knife I kept next to me, my fingers trembling. The seconds dragged on, the silence heavy, until finally, the steps started again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife and listening for any sign of the steps returning. They didn't. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the forest, I was already packed and ready to leave. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was exhausted, my legs weak from tension and lack of sleep. I still don't know what it was that night. Maybe it was an animal, maybe another person, but the way it moved, the silence, and how it stood so close to the tent without making a sound, it didn't feel natural. That trip taught me something important. Solitude can be as unsettling as it is peaceful. I haven't gone camping alone since. Camping alone had always been on my bucket list. The thought of being surrounded by nature with no distractions was something I'd been craving for months. So, when the weekend arrived with clear skies and cool weather, I grabbed my gear and headed for the mountains. The trail I chose was less popular, a narrow path winding through dense forests, leading to the heart of the wilderness. I'd hiked parts of it before, but this time I decided to go deeper, far beyond where most people would venture. I wanted isolation, a complete break from the noise of the world. The hike started early in the morning, and the first few hours were peaceful. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional scurry of a squirrel or rabbit. I felt at ease, enjoying the rhythm of my footsteps on the trail and the fresh, earthy smell of the woods. By the time I found a suitable spot to set up camp, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The clearing I chose was perfect. It was flat, close to a bubbling creek, and surrounded by towering pine trees. Their shadows stretched long across the ground as I pitched my tent and gathered wood for a fire. As night fell, the forest around me grew quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the only sound was the constant gurgling of the creek nearby. I built a small fire, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the trees. Sitting by the fire, I ate a simple meal and stared at the flames, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. The silence of the forest at night is different from the silence of a city. It's heavier, almost pressing. It makes you aware of every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch. But I didn't mind. This was what I had come for. By 9 p.m., the fire had burned low, and the cold night air was creeping in. I decided to call it a night. After dousing the fire, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and let the soothing sound of the creek lull me to sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. I lay still, listening to the quiet. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like leaves crunching underfoot. My heart started to race as I strained to hear more. The sound grew clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. The steps weren't heavy, but they didn't sound like an animal. They had a rhythm, something too deliberate to be random. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another camper? But why would someone be walking around my campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? The footsteps continued, circling closer. Then they stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. For a moment there was silence. Then, a soft scratching sound began. It was faint, like something lightly dragging across the fabric of my tent. It wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate, moving slowly along the edges of the tent, pausing here and there. I wanted to move, to grab the flashlight and knife I had within reach, but fear pinned me in place. I couldn't see anything through the tent's thin walls, only hear that faint, steady scratching. My imagination ran wild. Was it an animal? Person? Something worse? The scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was almost more unsettling. I lay there, gripping the handle of my knife, waiting. Then, I heard it, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the leaves. It moved away from the tent, slow and uneven, fading into the distance. I didn't move. I didn't dare unzip the tent to look outside. I stayed perfectly still, listening for any signs of the sound returning. But the forest remained quiet. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep, my knife still clutched in my hand. When the first light of dawn seeped through the fabric of the tent, I forced myself to get up. The campsite looked untouched. No signs of footprints or anything unusual. I packed up my gear quickly, my nerves still on edge, and started the hike back to my car. Every step of the way, I felt like I was being watched. The once peaceful forest now seemed darker, the trees taller and more menacing. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was moving. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my car, relief washed over me like a wave. I threw my gear into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I sat there catching my breath, I realized how shaken I was. I still don't know what was out there that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal or some prankster wandering the woods. But something about the way those footsteps sounded, the deliberate way they circled my tent, still makes my skin crawl. I've gone camping since then, but I've never gone alone again. Whatever it was, I hope I never encounter it again.